Welcome to our channel, where we explore the fascinating world of architecture, design, and innovation. Join us as we dive into groundbreaking projects, analyze architectural masterpieces, and discuss the latest trends in the field of Kazuyo Sejima and Ryue Nishizawa. Let's embark on this architectural journey together. To begin our discussion on Kazuyo Sejima and Ryue Nishizawa, it's essential to relate them to the leading architects of our time. For instance, Foster Plus Partners employs over 1,000 architects, while firms like OMA and Herzog and de Meuron range between 300 to 400 employees. However, these young Japanese architects have always maintained a small office, never exceeding 30 to 40 people. Despite their modest team, they undertake highly ambitious projects. While they frequently participate in competitions across Europe, they are unable to enter any invited competitions in Japan. This is because Japanese competitions often require a minimum of 100 employees, a threshold they do not meet. As a result, the relatively small and domestic scale of their practice forces them to maintain a significant international presence, as we will explore later. And we've also made several biographical jumps, reflecting these age gaps. Between Foster and Koolhaas, there is a 9-year difference, and between Koolhaas and Herzog, 6 years. Similarly, there's another 6-year gap between Herzog and Kazuyo Sejima. She was born in 1956, making her the youngest protagonist we've discussed so far. However, the truly youngest protagonist is Ryue Nishizawa. Ryue Nishizawa is 10 years younger than Sejima, and is not only her professional partner, but also her romantic partner. When I say I'll be discussing the work of their studio, I should actually say I'll be discussing the work of their studios, because there are 3, in fact. The architects working under Sejima and Nishizawa are organized into 3 different entities. One of these is called Sana, which is the name of the office where they collaborate on joint projects. However, since 1995, when Kazuyo Sejima invited her young collaborator to become a partner, he chose to maintain his independence and run his own autonomous studio as well. Alongside their shared studio, there is Sejima's studio and Nishizawa's studio, each signing projects independently. I hope this doesn't make the explanation too confusing, but I thought it was important to highlight this from the beginning. The reason there are 3 studios under one umbrella probably has to do with Japan still being a very traditional society, where it's uncommon to find a woman leading an organization. For a man to work under a woman's leadership can sometimes cause friction, given the cultural context in Japan, leading to a certain instability. To achieve stability, they operate these 3 offices simultaneously. It's important to note that their major projects are always signed under both names, but for smaller projects, they continue to work individually. In fact, I'll start by trying to explain the architecture of these Japanese architects through 8 houses, most of which are signed by one or the other, with only a few jointly signed by both. As I mentioned earlier, theirs is the youngest office, and also the most challenging to interpret. With the previous architects, we can place them within a landscape of influences, both received and exerted. That is quite clear. This anatomy of influences, to borrow a term from Plum, is not easily applicable in the case of Sejima. While her work does have an evident mentor, Toyo Ito, with whom she started working and whom she still acknowledges as the person who inspired her architectural vision, her architecture is quite unique and difficult to associate with others. As you'll see shortly, and I'll show an image that I believe encapsulates this well, an image of her Kanazawa Museum, her architecture is very unusual and not easily linked to other styles. This image gives us an idea of the type of architecture we're dealing with, an architecture that is almost evanescent, characterized by lightness, transparency, and fluidity. It's an architecture that seeks to push boundaries, to strip away everything until it is almost nothing. Many critics have associated the architecture of Sejima and Nishizawa with contemporary Japanese otaku culture, for example, or with artists like Murakami, who creates these syntheses of European pop culture and the Japanese world of manga and anime, resulting in artworks that are superficially hedonistic and at the same time deeply nihilistic. Some have even described Sejima's architecture as superficial, much like Japanese culture, and reflective of the superficiality of our times. However, I would prefer to think that Sejima's architecture is not connected to this Murakami, the artist. Rather, I see her work as being more akin to Murakami, the writer, not the artist but the author of Norwegian Wood and Kafka on the Shore. He is someone who has confronted Japanese culture, its consumerism, its lack of spirituality, and its loss of traditional values. In his works, through a prose that blends Carver with Kafka, he formulates a critical vision of that world, a vision that allows us to understand it in a different, perhaps less superficial way. There's a Japanese photographer whose work I'm showing here who created a series called Happy Victims. These were happy victims of fashion, documenting the Japanese phenomenon of people who become obsessed with a particular brand, collecting only items from that brand, and living surrounded by clothes or objects associated with it. In this instance, I'm showing the room of a fan of Comme des Garçons, the fashion label. In this photographer's work, there's something similar to Sejima's architecture, a fascination with fashion, with the superficiality of glamour, but at the same time a critical, discomforting element. Kazuyo Sejima, by the way, often mentions that she is very fond of shopping, very interested in fashion. She says she prefers flowers over books, and her favorite brand, unsurprisingly, is Comme des Garçons. And here, you can see her dressed in a garment from that brand. This architect creates Japanese architecture, deeply rooted in the Japanese architectural tradition. Japanese architecture has had a significant influence in the West, a very important influence. Frank Lloyd Wright, as you know, built in Japan and was deeply influenced by Japanese architecture, to the point where he even collected and dealt in Japanese art. Alvar Aalto, for example, was also profoundly influenced by the Japanese world. Perhaps the person who contributed the most to spreading Japanese architecture in the West was Bruno Taut, with his 1935 book on Katsura and the Japanese house, which captured the imagination of modern architects. Now, I will quickly introduce the work of these architects through a journey across 8 houses, all produced within a span of 10 years. The first of them. The first house they built together is called the Es House. As you can see, in a typical setting, it resembles a lantern, just a few layers of polycarbonate. And inside, as you can see from these plans, the house is organized with a series of rooms and a perimeter corridor that connects them all. Each room opens inward and only minimally to the outside. They have this sort of corridor that separates the wooden rooms from the translucent gallery, making the house glow like a lantern at night. At the same time, it creates a space of translucent intimacy. This is the interior of the house, the one they designed together. It's quite different from other houses they each designed separately. Take, for example, this weekend house, a work by Ryue Nishizawa, the male partner in the duo. It's a weekend house, and therefore, when not in use, it's meant to be hermetically sealed, as you can see here, almost like a hermetic box. And in the floor plan, you can see that it is crossed by large courtyards that penetrate the interior and are finely enclosed. So, when the house is open, it looks like this, a single-story house perforated by courtyards, but which can be sealed like a box. And ultimately, This house reveals the light and translucent quality of Sejima's architecture, which strives for the walls to be so thin they almost disappear, and for the structures to be so slender they seem almost impossible. And this is the image of this house by Ryue Nishizawa. I'm going to contrast this with a house by Kazuyo Sejima called The Small House, which truly lives up to its name. It's a house, as often happens in Tokyo, with one floor stacked on top of another, and with a peculiar shape that simply adapts to the irregularities of the site and the need to accommodate its functions. You can see here that at one point the house even has to be set back to make room for the front of the car, because otherwise there's no way to fit the usual functions of a house into the mere 80 square meters available. The house is traversed by a spiral staircase that stacks these small spaces one on top of the other. And this is the image of its interior that you can see here. Shortly after, Kazuyo Sejima designed another house that captured everyone's imagination, the Plum Orchard House, again in Tokyo. This house is a perfectly cubic structure, built with almost no thickness to the walls. Just take a look. This is the floor plan of the house. Don't mistake it for a schematic. It's the actual floor plan. This shows the thickness of the partitions and walls. Why? Because the entire house is made of metal sheets, nothing more, just cut metal sheets. As a result, the connection with the exterior relies on this almost impossibly thin thickness. And it creates, so to speak, two intimate spaces. And in the end, these open and cut-out alcoves resemble more a house made of paper than a structure capable of withstanding the elements or regular use by people. Now let's contrast these last two houses by Sejima with this one by Nishizawa. This house is best explained with this sketch by the architect. Instead of designing a typical house, 2.5 or 3 stories with different rooms, he said, "Since the owner wants to rent out the rooms, why don't we take the rooms and scatter them across the plot like a game, like a concert of boxes within an enclosure?" And this is the floor plan of that unusual house, which you'll understand better when you see it photographed. A set of rooms, each of which is a separate space someone uses. Take a look at it from above. And now, let's take a closer look at the bathroom. This set of corridors and small spaces forces you, of course, to step outside to go to the bathroom, move from one room to another, or use the kitchen. This extreme fragmentation of the program is something you have to be bold enough to attempt, and the client has to accept that their house will be a collection of separate rooms, almost like pavilions in a garden. However, it creates a completely new type of architecture. And sometimes this concept is expressed in a more conventional way, as in other horizontal houses like this one, the A house, which you can see here in the floor plan, a series of rooms arranged horizontally. This is the exterior facade. And you can see it better here, as it reaches a significant height with those dizzying staircases that are typical in Japanese houses. And as you can see, it's filled with plants and objects, many of which were designed by Sejima herself, like this stool with its little ears, or this candelabra vase, for example, which you can see better here in this other image, and which I wanted to highlight with this brief mention. Kazuyo Sejima and Nishizawa took these ideas even further in an unbuilt house project that I've brought up here, even though it was never constructed, because it's so extreme that it deserves to be seen. It's called The House and Garden. And notice how what was once a series of rooms placed one behind the other is now stacked one on top of the other. Essentially, each level contains a tiny space and vegetation. It's a house of dizzying staircases and plants, nothing more. Sejima has often said that she can't live without plants, that she can't live without trees. She's also said that she doesn't read architects. What she loves are plants, flowers, and fashion. Many might see this as a provocation, especially when other architects pride themselves on being well-read and knowledgeable. But Sejima, perhaps even emphasizing her difference, speaks of a love for plants over a love for books. For many of us who come from a literary culture, this may be difficult to understand, but Sejima's architecture cannot be fully grasped without considering her deep love for plants and that ubiquitous presence of vegetation. And this is the last house I'll share with you, and this one was indeed designed by both of them. It was created for a Swiss client, and here I'm showing it only as a model, a very large model at a 1:2 scale that was exhibited at the Musée in Lyon during the monographic exhibition dedicated to them in 2007. As you can see, the house is almost amoeba-shaped, with circular courtyards and surrounded by a perimeter of glass. The house merges with the surrounding vegetation at its original site, but here, of course, we see it within the walls of a museum, only in this model. At a 1:2 scale, you can see it in the Musée, and when you look up, you can see the grand structure of this museum by Tugnan and Mansilla. These 8 houses trace a journey, and I believe that journey is best summarized not by any of the houses themselves, but by a design object, the tea set they designed for Alessi, which was first exhibited at the Musée. Each piece was crafted, carved from soap shaped like fruits, so that in the end, the tea set resembles a tray of fruits. It's an object filled with poetry and magic, something that has to captivate us all. It's so magical to transform a tea set, where you would typically imagine a tray with the pieces, into a basket of fruit, a basket of metallic fruits. And this is what this pair of Japanese architects has created, a partnership that, as I mentioned, began in 1995. However, Sejima had a bit of history before that, which I will briefly recount. Sejima entered the world of architecture with this work. A women's residence, a work that fascinated all of us, not only because of Sejima's design itself, but also because of the social fabric that created it. It's a residence for single women. These are women in their first year of work at a large company, and the company believes it must protect them during this initial year in a big city. These are women coming from rural areas, and the idea is to keep them safe in a setting that is a mix of a boarding school and almost a penitentiary, as you can see. The young women sleep in small cells, 4 to a room, with translucent walls, constantly supervised by a matron who oversees the entire facility. We might see this as an intolerable restriction of freedom, but in the Japanese context, it was viewed as a way to protect young women from rural areas during their first year in the big city, until they could learn to navigate and manage the complexities and challenges of this new environment. As you can see, everything was constructed with Sejima's signature precise geometries and lightweight surfaces. But at that time, she was still partly influenced by her training with Toyo Ito, which is evident in these gestures, these pastel colors, and these oval shapes that stem from the postmodern architecture of that era. Sejima wasn't fully Sejima as a creator yet, but she was beginning to show it in the radical nature of her proposals, which ultimately expresses itself in environments like this, reinterpretations of traditional Japanese architecture for very new and very different uses, those of contemporary Japanese corporations. Her second work was also quite disconcerting, and this opportunity came to her due to her condition as a woman. Arata Isozaki, whom we've already discussed because he promoted Rem Koolhaas's first international project in Fukuoka, also promoted a housing complex where he decided, with the help of his political connections, that the project should be designed exclusively by women architects. So, the various residential units were assigned only to female architects. As a result, Sejima, as an architect, was commissioned to design this residential block, which she executed once again with dimensions that seem almost impossible to achieve, so extremely narrow. You can see it here. This is the floor plan. It's barely a corridor running through the entire building, with very small residential units, and especially with the two facades so close to each other. One might think that this doesn't make sense architecturally, that you can't have so much facade for such a small enclosed volume. But this would become a constant theme throughout Sejima's work. This is the final expression of the elevation, where you can see it filled with these stairs at a 45-degree angle, no less, stairs that connect the sections of the small apartments. As you can see above, they interlock with each other like a Lego, so the sections overlap, and in nearly all the residential units, there are double-height spaces, accessible by the stairs we saw earlier. This is the image of the main facade where the small apartments are laid out. And this is the rear facade, with those endless staircases and the courtyards that pierce through the extremely thin structure, expressing and emphasizing its slenderness. Sejima's career reaches its culmination before Nishizawa's, although we'll look at a few more projects by Sejima, projects that belong to their joint studio like this one. These projects showcase her extremism and her determination to push beyond all reasonable architectural boundaries, as you can see here, for example. This is a residential project, and it has to be shown in plan because Sejima's architecture cannot be fully explained without drawings. Notice there are 9 units, meaning 9 apartments of 50 square meters each, but look at the unusual way they are organized. Imagine trying to place furniture in there, to live in it, or even just to move around inside. It's quite challenging. In the end, everything was built, and these are things that, when you see them in the project phase, you might wonder how it's possible. That there wouldn't be anyone capable of constructing these concrete slabs or anyone able to promote and sell these unusual units. This one, however, was never built. It didn't come to fruition, but I'm mentioning it because it's so interesting. What you see here, which might seem like a random collection of pieces, is actually a residential complex. Each of these pieces is a housing unit, and they fit together as you can see here in this plan. It's essentially a large slab perforated by courtyards, as you can see here, and accessed from below. From below, through this network of staircases, you pass underneath the slab, and you access the residential units through the courtyards, entering this articulated and assembled collection of spaces, culminating in that perforated slab. In this case, it wasn't built, but sooner or later she will manage to realize it because she is very persistent. She works from 10 in the morning until 3 in the morning every day, and after lunch, she takes a nap under the table. Someone who works 15 hours a day, 7 days a week, eventually gets things done because clients end up feeling overwhelmed by her intensity and determination. Sejima has created architecture so translucent, so ethereal, that her mentor Toyo Ito once said, "Sejima's architecture is like that of video games, only suitable for androids, for bodies without scent, without warmth." And there is some truth to that, in her desire to create architecture that is physical but almost virtual. As you can see here in this center, this design studio has pushed the boundaries to such extremes that, to U.S. architects, they seem impossible. Take a look, for example, at this small cafe in a park. From a distance, you might not even notice it. It doesn't seem to have much to it, but when you get closer, you wonder, how is it possible to make such slender columns? How does this all stay up? Why doesn't it topple over? Where are the rigid elements that keep it from collapsing? The truth is, they're hidden, concealed. Take a look at this. At first glance, you wouldn't notice it, and you have to look for a while to see it. This is a large steel plate, treated in such a way that it acts as a mirror to make it almost invisible. But each of these small pavilions requires two large steel plates in perpendicular directions to prevent them from collapsing in any direction. What we call bracing, that is, preventing this house of cards from falling down, is done by these hidden steel elements. The large plates that prevent collapse are there, but we don't see them. They dissolve into this world of landscapes, reflections, lightness, and transparency. Or even further, in this ferry terminal, when you're walking down the street, look around and notice the thicknesses of things. The thickness of the slabs, the thickness of the columns, the thickness of the roofs. Has anyone seen something with these proportions? We see it drawn and think, it's not possible. When it gets built, we expect everything to become a bit thicker to ensure stability. But that's not the case. Sejima makes it happen, once again using almost theatrical techniques like large steel plates disguised as mirrors. But in the end, of course, here you have one of them. You see, in the end, you can spot one of the tricks that allows the building to stand. And they dissolve into that landscape of reflections, but they create buildings of such perfection and lightness that it's truly moving. Here, it's more noticeable. The trick is visible right away. This same lightweight architecture was employed, or rather, they employed it, since it's a joint project, for the IVAM, Instituto Valenciano de Arte Moderno expansion project, which they won through a competition. While the other contestants proposed adding new structures to the city that would allow the museum to expand, Sejima did something brilliant. She said, instead of adding pieces, I'll take the original building and place it inside a box where more things will happen. The original building is placed inside a nearly translucent box made of metal mesh. In the end, the city will perceive it as if it doesn't exist, as if it's not even there. And once again, it showcases these slender forms, which I especially emphasize for the architects. How is it possible for a column to be so thin? One might think, this can only hold up if it's suspended from above. It can't support compressive loads. How can this be? She hasn't managed to build it yet, but many of us hope she will succeed. And that this one and only Sejima project in Spain so far will finally become a reality. A project, however, that serves to introduce another kind of concern from the office. It's a somewhat frustrated project, the only one among Sejima's works that she almost refuses to sign. She says, they did such a poor job. It's a theater in Almere, Netherlands. What you see here is the exterior, which has that somewhat minimalist quality of abstract prisms, but that's not what's important. There are many examples of architecture like this. What was important was the floor plan. A floor plan where, as you can see, there are no corridors. Every space is connected to another in a sort of labyrinth. The great contribution of the building was precisely this. Not that it was housed within a more or less minimalist and well-executed prism. It was a floor plan where the traditional separation of corridor and room disappears. However, the Dutch built it full of corridors everywhere, with rooms scattered around, completely destroying the concept that Sejima wanted to convey. That's why she says, it's a building I designed, but I don't dare to call it mine. It's not truly my own. It has none of what I wanted to achieve. Where she did succeed with this idea of the fragmented floor plan was in two other buildings, both extraordinary, one of them being Kanazawa, a museum in Japan which was designed as a series of prismatic pieces, as you can see here, with one cylindrical piece, all within a large circular enclosure. The building is located in a park, meaning that, while it's surrounded by buildings, It has plenty of vegetation around it, allowing it to blend into its environment. And as you can see, the floor plan is extraordinary. It's a plan that has already made its mark in architectural history. In this case, instead of fragmenting the entire floor plan into spaces that flow into one another, it consists of a series of freestanding pieces. The circulation happens through this labyrinth of corridors, or rather, interstitial spaces, left between the boxes. Sejima created more than 100 models with the museum director until they found the right sequence of boxes to house the museum's collection. This is the final floor plan. And this is what it looks like. Flowing, as you can see, into this gardened area, with those transparencies that lead you to the courtyards. And with this final view of the exhibition rooms in this museum, the first image I showed you, Kanazawa, which I said encapsulates her architecture well, where the branching vegetation fills the entire space. This Kanazawa Museum was justly admired. At the 2004 Venice Biennale of Architecture, the Golden Lion Awards elevated her to the status of a major international figure. 6 years later, she was invited back to Venice as the curator of the entire exhibition, which indeed happened. In this way, Venice also became a turning point in Sejima's career. The other building that also marked a significant transformation in the work of this Japanese team was in the United States, in Toledo, or as they say, Toledo, Ohio. In this state, glass production has historically been very important, and the museum wanted to have an annex, a pavilion dedicated specifically to glassmaking. So, Sejima designed a glass pavilion for them, a structure made entirely of glass, almost redundantly so. But with this floor plan, which shows the successive visions and the final plan, you can see here how the ideas from the Almere Theater were eventually realized. Don't be misled by the fact that here the corners are all rounded, while in Almere they were all rectangles. That doesn't matter. What's important is that the traditional hierarchy of access, arrival, and distribution is no longer present. Instead, there are a series of spaces that flow into one another, and through them the museum takes shape. As you can see here, like a collection of pieces. Transparent pieces that open out into the landscape, which reveal these gaps between the main facade and the also glass-enclosed spaces that house the meeting rooms or the service areas of the museum, which then crystallizes into this view that you can see here from one of the courtyards. That establishes this connection with the exterior. And in the end, they offer us this image of, I don't know if I should call it, a kind of ethereal condition, where reflections merge with the architecture to create an almost dreamlike environment. It feels as if we are inhabiting a dream, unable to distinguish the circulation paths. The succession of glass planes and the fact that they are rounded causes everything to blend together, ultimately giving us this extraordinary image. Of course, Toledo, Ohio isn't a place most people visit, but the images of the museum spread widely, significantly boosting Sejima's prestige in the United States, which would later lead to a commission we'll discuss later. But before that, we'll talk about her work in the fashion world. For Dior, she built a headquarters in Omotesando, the same neighborhood where we saw the Prada headquarters by Herzog and de Meuron. Right next to the Prada building is the Dior headquarters. Sejima wanted to create it with curved glass panels to evoke the movement of women's clothing and to give the whole structure that Venezian quality once again. The building ultimately looks like this. As you can see, it's a tall structure within Tokyo's fashion district, and it has something very interesting which would also appear later in the American Commission. And that is, it doesn't clearly reveal its section to the exterior. You may have noticed many lines that you might assume are floor slabs, but that's not the case. Sometimes they coincide with a slab, and sometimes they don't, so the building hides its scale. It presents a structure where we can't tell how many floors it has. When we look at it, it seems like a small skyscraper, but in reality it's just 4 large rooms stacked on top of each other. This layering of scales gives it a special magic because we don't relate to it as we would with a typical building or in relation to the human body. When you see a window or a door, you usually know a person can look out or pass through it. Here, there's no reference to the body, no reference even to the successive floors. On the contrary, it's a deceptive, ambiguous building and in many ways theatrical. And here you can see it with daytime lighting. The museum in New York is quite different, but it's also a tall building. It should be noted that tall buildings aren't Sejima's specialty. It's very difficult to achieve her world of reflections, evanescence, transparency, and lightness in a tall building, which has strict regulations from fire safety, security, etc. A tall building has very different conditions that don't easily lend themselves to that light and evanescent architecture. However, she has managed to develop it with a certain dignity in this new museum in New York, located in a degraded area, the Bowery, surrounded by buildings in very poor condition. She designed it as a succession of boxes in an unstable balance, once again trying to convey that sense of lightness. In other cases, she achieved this with tricks of scale. Here, she does it by making the boxes appear as though they might fall. You might say, but we've seen this stacking in Koolhaas, we've seen it in Herzog. There was a time when this approach was very fashionable. Let's consider how the relationship between the structure and the exterior is not direct. In other words, some aspects are expressed on the exterior and some are not. One of the key dogmas of modern architecture was that it had to be honest, meaning it should express its function on the exterior and not have a discrepancy between the face of the architecture and the body behind it. However, Sejima's architecture is always different. I wouldn't call it dishonest, but rather illusionistic. It's always theatrical. It never reveals what's behind. We don't know what's behind when we look at the section. We see what the floors are, where the rooms are, but when we look at the building, we don't know. We see stacked boxes and assume each box is a floor, but then, when we see a section, we realize that's not the case. You might say, well, we've seen these stacked boxes in many other architects' works, and in fact, it has almost become a cliché of 1990s architecture. Stacked boxes have been used everywhere, even in furniture advertisements. They've used stacked boxes in Japan as well, so it's not all that original in that sense. What is original, however, is in how she uses those boxes, as you can see in the models from her studio, with a different purpose. It's not just about creating an image of instability and thereby communicating lightness, because only something light can appear unstable, but the shifts between the boxes create spaces that function as skylights or terraces. These spaces are integrated with the interior zones, allowing the art spaces to have natural lighting that they otherwise wouldn't be able to achieve. In the end, Sejima was very pleased, as you can see, with her final box, and she posed with it. Of course, it's not her best project, but it was in New York, and New York is the world showcase. Building in New York was so important for her, and for anyone, that this project, which isn't among the most significant in her portfolio, became the most widely publicized. For many reasons, it became the most well-known and the most visited by people. As you can see here, the sequence was expanded and the mission was showcased as a poster for its inauguration. And in the end, this is the image it presents among the streets of this area in southern Manhattan. The exterior image, as you can see, is typical for these art spaces, a well-lit white cube, and sometimes it even feels sordid in its hermetic condition. Occasionally, these skylights appear, which come from the displacements of the boxes. And there are also exciting moments, like a staircase of, once again, unimaginable narrowness that runs through the building. But the most significant aspect is how it's covered with this metallic mesh that looks like this from the interior and like this from the exterior. And they chose to photograph themselves precisely on a terrace like this, but one that faces the offices. And they chose to be photographed on a terrace like this one, but one that overlooks the offices, to capture themselves as the creators of what was, at that moment, the culmination of their career. It was inaugurated in 2007, and 3 years later, they would return to New York, but for another purpose, to receive the Pritzker Prize, which would be awarded to them on Ellis Island, New York, marking the culmination of recognition for their extraordinary career. However, Sejima's work would have better moments than New York, and one of them, for example, is in Essen. This building, a business school for people who want to dedicate themselves to the world of art, is a very specialized institution. It's a business school, but for those who wish to become managers in the world of art, fashion, and design. It was promoted to revitalize an area of post-industrial decline in the Rhineland, which needed regeneration with new public investments. What remains there are abandoned blast furnaces from steelworks that no longer have use. Sejima built this unusual building, which again emphasizes what I mentioned about the hermetic nature of her facades. We see this and don't know what's behind it, whether there's 1 floor, 4 floors, or if it's a large empty cube. We don't know. We have to look at the floor plans to see that there are 4 floors inside. As you can see, with those random facades, there are indeed 4 floors, which are ultimately supported only by 2 columns. The rest are embedded within the functional areas. And when we see the section, we understand the building, which indeed consists of just 4 large rooms, 1, 2, 3, and 4, stacked one on top of the other, plus the terrace. But from the outside, we would never have guessed because this random arrangement of square windows gives us no clues, just like we didn't have any clues with the Dior building or the new museum in New York. You will also notice that it is not only a fascinating and hermetic facade due to its difficulty to interpret and understand, but also because of its thinness. Look at it at night. You can see it even better. I invite you to consider how many buildings we've seen with such an incredibly thin facade. How can it be achieved? How can it be done? It's not possible to isolate it from the climate. It's very cold in the Ruhr Valley. How does Sejima manage to create a facade where you wonder, where is the insulation? Where is the thermal inertia? How is it possible to do this? In this case, it involves a technical resource. Hot water serpentine pipes embedded like in underfloor heating, thanks to their geothermal energy, which provides very cheap or almost free hot water. With these serpentine pipes, the entire facade can act as a radiator, enabling Sejima to create such a thin facade that it looks like it's cut out of a cardboard model. Again, to achieve this completely illusionistic impression requires a lot of technology and knowledge. And this is ultimately the result of the building. And it has moments of beauty and emotion that are difficult to match, in my opinion, far superior to those of the New York Museum. Even though it's easier for us to travel to New York than to Essen to visit it, this is Sejima. With these buildings, she has already secured a place in the history of contemporary architecture. And she has received such unusual invitations, like the one to design for Novartis. Novartis is, well, I don't know if I should call it an architectural zoo, but it is indeed a zoo of architectures. Novartis is a major pharmaceutical company in Basel whose president is a man in love with architecture. He wanted to make the company a place that hires the best architects in the world to design its campus. They have built with everyone, from Raphael Moneo to Frank Gehry, Herzog and de Meuron, and the list goes on. Sejima was commissioned to design an office building. This is the campus by the Rhine in Basel. Each of those pieces you see there was designed by a different architect, all of them part of this kind of first division of architecture. And when Sejima worked on this project, the real estate division came along and said, "But how is it possible, Miss Sejima? How can you make something with these two facades so close together? There's no room for offices, no room for desks, nothing fits." But look at the section. The section is extraordinary. It's incredible. One wouldn't imagine that such a building could exist. In the end, it's a large screen, but it's only 4 meters deep. It only fits one person, another person, another person, and a corridor for circulation. The view at the entrance of the campus is beautiful. It's like a large screen that presents the campus. Of course, with carefully chosen furniture, all homogeneous, it's like an exhibition. But when you move inside, it's very uncomfortable because there's nothing more than a work desk and a corridor. You have to disturb everyone you pass by. I don't know any office building in the world that has been built with 2 glass facades 4 meters apart. It seems like something unusual, but Sejima achieved it like so many other things. And finally, to conclude, with 4 pavilions and 2 buildings. 4 pavilions. Some of them interventions in existing pavilions, others temporary, others permanent, that express a bit of the moment in Sejima and Sezagua's architecture. This is an intervention they did in the Mies van der Rohe Pavilion in Barcelona, which everyone is quite familiar with, where they inserted these curved glass panels that will look familiar from the Ohio project. And indeed, they contribute to seeing Mies's architecture from a different perspective, introducing the illusory element into what was originally an extremely rigorous building, where the dissolution of space and the creation of the open plan excluded this play of reflections. Sejima introduces what I'm saying is only an installation. This is not an installation. It's a pavilion, though it is also ephemeral, lasting only 1 summer. The Serpentine Gallery in London commissions a prominent architect each summer to create an ephemeral pavilion that lasts for the season. All the great architects have done it, and this is the one Sejima created, again with these somewhat amoebic forms. Here is the floor plan of the pavilion. And here is the image with its chairs, which you can see housed underneath. It's just a subtle gesture in the park, a gesture that, from a distance with that extraordinarily thin roof, dissolves and blends into the vegetation. It's a gesture that disappears. Even further, she has wanted to push the limits with a series of pavilions she has created on a Japanese island to house works of art, and they all have the appearance you see here. This is one of them. This is another one that almost disappears again, because it is just a corridor with 2 translucent spaces, 2 translucent membranes. Or this small, ridiculous one, which defies the limits of lightness. This one was made solely by Sejima. Her partner, Nishizawa, when given a similar commission on another island, also for a small pavilion, did something very different. Notice how Sejima sought this strategy of disappearance, while Nishizawa, on the other hand, did a large concrete shell, a great concrete blanket, which forms an unusual space in that extraordinary Japanese nature, and ultimately gives us images like this. This idea of the concrete blanket is what they used to create the last building they inaugurated in Lausanne, in French-speaking Switzerland. The Rolex Center for the university is a multi-use center with libraries, various restaurants, workspaces for students and professors. It won an international competition with the following stipulations. Architects could choose any plot they wanted and design any type of building they preferred, considering this was all the space the university had available to expand and grow. Sejima made the unusual decision, unlike all other competitors, not to select a fragment or another part of the campus, but to use the entire space. If the university wants to build a biotechnology or nanotechnology institute in the future, they would have to buy more land because Sejima decided to use all the available space, leaving nothing behind. This was another point of contention with the university administrator who said, "This cannot be. You cannot use all the land we have." Nevertheless, Sejima did it and built it, 2 parallel concrete blankets as you can see. With this extraordinary plan where each of the uses is housed in these almost ethereal bubbles. Here you see it in the model, in the office model they used to design it, and you can understand it even better if we remove the cover from that model. And then you see everything that is underneath that cover. Sejima was pleased, of course, and that's why she is photographed with the model. And even more pleased when, with a titanic effort that only Swiss construction with its precision and elegance could undertake. And even more pleased when, with a titanic effort that only Swiss construction with its precision and elegance could undertake, they managed to build the building, which has this appearance at night. Which thus manifests its sleek geometry. And in the end, it also leaves us with images like this, extraordinary images of an architecture that, I believe, deserves both our applause and our astonishment. It is an irreplaceable architecture, not one like that of other architects from which we can learn. For us, it's not just something pedagogical to share with our colleagues, professors, and students at the school. How can someone who is tasked with designing a library and restaurants immediately propose such a sleek concept in both directions? Well, the technical and financial effort and the land use is colossal, but in the end, the result is a memorable icon, and all this is achieved in a relatively small studio. And it has this somewhat grim appearance, with the light from the windows above barely any natural light where people work 13 or 16 hours, sometimes sleeping under the tables. And yet, despite this, Sejima, with these projects, has become one of the greats in the world of architecture. When Sarkozy became president of France in 2007, he said, "I will take my family photo." But he didn't take it with his ministers, knowing they would be forgotten in 10 or 50 years. He said, "My family photo will be with my architects." And here is Sarkozy in his inauguration, with his Minister of Culture, surrounded by the great architects of France and the world. You will certainly recognize our protagonists. Here, you'll see Norman Foster, with the visionary technique we saw on the first day. You'll also see Renzo Piano, the abrasive intellectual writer. And of course, you can see Jack Herzog here behind, next to Nobel. Here is Jack Herzog, along with another important woman in the world of architecture, Zaha Hadid. And of course, Kazuyo Sejima, dressed as usual, somewhat reserved, along with another Japanese architect, Siger Ubam. They were tasked with designing the 2 major French museums in the provinces, the Pompidou and the Louvre. You may know that Siger Ubam designed the Pompidou in Metz, which, by the way, faced considerable criticism and was not seen as worthy of his talent. Sejima was given the assignment for the Louvre in Lens. In northern France, a project for the Louvre, establishing its first branch or extension, and it was assigned to Sejima. The project is extraordinary. She mentioned that she is now dedicating herself solely to this project, as it is so challenging that she needs to put all her energy into it. She has many small projects, but the only one that currently occupies all her time and effort is the construction of these pieces, which appear to be randomly placed in the middle of this park. These pieces conform to this floor plan that you see here, which is very similar to others we have seen. And it has this interior image where, as you can see, Sejima occasionally depicts herself, sometimes in the plans. And they strive above all, through the enclosures and through this illusionistic strategy, to disappear, to fade away, to reach a state of non-existence. Until a great museum can be nothing more than a reflection that we see dissolve and fade away, and whose image we can no longer associate with a memorable icon. We think of Wright's Guggenheim, oh yes, a great spiral, or the titanium storm of Bilbao. We can associate all these museums with an icon, with an image etched into memory. But here, Sejima takes the strategy of disappearance to its ultimate consequences. In truth, the essence of Sejima's architecture is that it invites us to be austere, to achieve spiritual purification through that stripping away. Or is it superficial because we are all superficial? Is it because she wants us to be, or because we simply are? That's a question I haven't been able to answer. What I do know is that this strategy of extreme lightness, sometimes completely inconceivable in conventional architectural terms, produces aesthetic and emotional results. I sometimes say, I understand Foster, I understand Koolhaas, I understand Herzog, but Sejima I don't understand. I admire her with astonishment and awe, but I don't understand her. Yet I admire this strategy of disappearance. To conclude, I also want to include the image of the finished museum so you can see the slenderness, transparency, and the layering of the building as it has been completed. Enjoy the image, and thank you for your attention. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Kazuyo Sejima's remarkable architectural achievements. From the elusive beauty of her designs to the innovative approaches that challenge conventional architecture, we've seen how her work creates spaces that are both profound and visually striking. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Sejima's work, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more architectural insights and explorations. Your support helps us continue to bring you content that celebrates the art and science of architecture. Until next time, keep exploring and appreciating the beauty in design. See you in the next video.